People play to win, so the best Pokemon are used the most often. With over 1,000 Pokemon, it means that some Pokemon are never going to see the big stage. A Pokemon being good isn't enough. With so much competition, to be top tier you have to be great, you have to be spectacular. But what happens to all those good Pokemon who don't get used? The tiering system is a fan-made conception that lets you use those underappreciated Pokemon. Pokemon are put into tiers based on their usage rates, and each tier becomes a metagame where Pokemon can fight against other Pokemon of a similar power level. If you want to use a Pokemon in a higher tier than its place, you can do that, you just can't go lower. They give a place for trainers to use some of their favorites in an environment where they're more evenly matched. Maybe you want to use Flygon, a perfectly good Pokemon, but Flygon isn't elite and you'd have a tough time making it work at the highest level. But Flygon's usage rate puts it in the 3rd tier and it's a good Pokemon over there. You can play the 3rd tier with your Flygon and actually have a fair fight. The underused format, or UU, is the 2nd tier in the tiering system created by the Smogon community. UU Pokemon are essentially Pokemon that are good, even great, but maybe not great enough. The UU format has existed for almost 20 years now, and certain Pokemon have made a name for themselves as really good UU Pokemon. I'm going to talk about my top 10 underused Pokemon of all time. The reason it's intriguing is because if they'd been any better, they would have been a 1st tier Pokemon, but they've established themselves as the elite of UU. Let's get into it. But first, a word from our sponsor. Managing a YouTube channel while trying to figure out what you want from life can be overwhelming. It's a constant juggle between your online presence and real life responsibilities. That can lead to feeling burned out, unsure, and struggling to find balance. It's tough, but remember, it's essential to take care of your mental health just as you do your physical health. A lot of people can relate to that struggle to find balance. It's what I personally go through as well. That's why I'm introducing you to today's video sponsor, BetterHelp, an incredible online resource that can help you take control of your happiness and your mental health. If you're serious about making a positive change, click on the link below to get started. BetterHelp connects you with licensed therapists who provide unbiased advice. The impartiality is invaluable. You can discuss your issues without any bias, unlike talking to friends and family. That's a very big difference. These therapists are solely focused on helping you identify and address your problems, offering actionable steps to resolve them. BetterHelp has a network of over 30,000 licensed therapists, ensuring you get the right fit for your needs. You can change therapists at no additional cost until you find the right match. Getting started is simple. Click the link below this video or visit betterhelp.com/freezeye and they'll match you with the most suitable therapist within 48 hours or less in most cases. You can then schedule therapy sessions at your convenience, whether it's over the phone, through chat, or via video, although I do recommend video the most. Everyone can benefit from therapy, so don't neglect it. Join the over 4 million people who have used BetterHelp to start living a happier, healthier life. Click the link below this video for 10% off your first month of therapy. Coming in at number 10, we have Milotic. Milotic actually started off in the 1st tier in its debut generation. It was notable for its defensive typing of pure water and access to recover. Overall, it was a hard Pokemon to break through thanks to only having 2 weaknesses, a massive special defense stat, and its ability to recover off any damage. But it wasn't long in the limelight, as from Gen 4 onward, it was never comfortably 1st tier again. Only attacking with the water type isn't good enough, and ideally you want a dual stab. So it's most often a defensive Pokemon with moves like Toxic or Haze. That can be great at stopping offensive sweepers, but it doesn't progress the game too quickly. It was able to get away with that in Gen 3 when the power levels were lower and teams did not have tools like Stealth Rock, Toxic Spikes, or a large pool of setup moves to get past bulky Pokemon. But these modern tools rip right past Milotic. A simple way to think about why Milotic struggled in OU the 1st tier is because while Milotic's tools never really changed, the game around it kept getting stronger and stronger. Every generation, newer Pokemon were being introduced, and often better Pokemon were being introduced too, new moves, everything. Even better water types were introduced to replace Milotic. Milotic suffered from power creep. Still, the role of an immovable object genre of water type is still a good Pokemon, provided you are sufficiently immovable. At the lower power level of the 2nd tier, it was often good enough to make it a pick on defensive and balanced teams throughout many UU generations. Sometimes it would drop even lower, like to RU the 3rd tier, but overall that's enough to land it at number 10. My 9th pick is Empoleon. Empoleon's claim to fame competitively is that in Gen 6, Empoleon learned Defog, making it one of the few hazard removers that resist Stealth Rock. Usually, Defog is only on Flying-type Pokemon, which is an inherent anti-synergy because Flying-type Pokemon are weak to Stealth Rock. Empoleon's movesets and underused were usually defensive and full of utility moves like the aforementioned Defog. Empoleon has a very balanced spread of stats with acceptable bulk and a pretty high special attack stat. Physical attackers especially have to be scared of Empoleon's scald burns if they underestimate trying to switch in. Empoleon fit well on balanced teams as the water element of the tried and true Fire Water Grass core, with the water and steel typing creating a good defensive type. All of these factors sound really good, but still Empoleon has some weaknesses holding it back from overused viability. Empoleon is an in-betweener. It's neither elite defensively nor elite offensively. Offensively it's slow, and steel isn't a great offensive typing. Similar to Milotic, it didn't have the right stab combo or speed to be effective. You'd rather use a Pokemon like Keldeo if you want that much power. Defensively, for most of its career, Empoleon did not have Roost, so it was a defensive Pokemon that couldn't heal itself, which is really crippling. Defensive Pokemon need to have a recovery move to be effective long term, and Empoleon didn't have that. Empoleon struggled to be relevant in the first tier, especially when you compare it to other elite options like Keldeo or Toxapex. Empoleon only hung out in the first tier in its debut generation when the spread of water-type Pokemon was much smaller, and it usually opted to run offensive ideas like Agility plus Pataya Berry. Other than that, it's been a consistent UU Pokemon where it doesn't stand out in any one aspect, but it's good at a lot of the little things. Empoleon is not an elite Pokemon, but it's good, and it's been consistent in UU for over a decade now, and that landed a pretty comfortable spot at number 9. At number 8, we have Slowking. For the most part, Slowking has been trapped in Slowbro's shadow. The difference in the two Slow brothers looks insignificant. They have their defense and special defense swapped, but that makes all the difference. Water is a better type for a physical defender because Grass and Electric are often special attacking Pokemon. Having a boosted special defense doesn't mean much when you get hit super effectively anyway. You're probably going to switch out anyway, so you don't use that special defense as much. But a high physical defense is more broadly applicable as there are more neutral types to take on. Slowbro had a better matchup into strong physical attackers over the years like Mega Medicham and Excadrill. Slowking doesn't get used when Slowbro gets used instead. But Slowking is not bad, just overshadowed. It has everything that makes Slowbro good. It has good defenses, a good typing, regenerator, and good moves like Slack Off, Scald, and Thunder Wave. Slowking would be a higher tier if Slowbro didn't exist. There are few situations that make it worth using over Slowbro. The only time in recent memory was when Freeze Dry Kyurem was dominating the metagame and Slowking's high special defense came in handy over there. But otherwise, Slowbro's generally better. Slowking sits comfortably as a number 7 best underused competitive Pokemon. Number 7 is Cobalion. Cobalion has been a UU Pokemon for most of its lifetime since its release in Generation 5. It's a relatively fast Steel-type Pokemon with a good defense stat. It has a decent move pool too. It could either be a Stealth Rock utility Pokemon or a sweeper Pokemon with options like Swords Dance or Rock Polish. The main problem is that its stats are not as optimized as they could be. It's too weak offensively. Look at Terrakion, a Pokemon who is typically higher tier than Cobalion. Even though Steel is generally better than Rock, Terrakion has the edge. The reason is because Terrakion has a much higher attack stat, and Stone Edge plus Close Combat is much stronger than Iron Head plus Close Combat. Cobalion doesn't have immediate power, so it almost needs to get a Swords Dance to be effective. But even then, it's not elite. It can't get past Pokemon like Latios or top defensive Pokemon like Toxapex. Also, unless you use something exotic like Hidden Power Ice, Cobalion flat out loses to Landorus T. Honestly, unlike some other Pokemon in the list, Cobalion's issues are not only with its fundamentals, it's with the metagame around it too. Furthermore, without a recovery move defensively, Cobalion can get worn down over time, and offensively it's a little slow and it's a little too weak. There's also some anti-synergy with Steel and Fighting. Fairy types are common, especially in the top tiers, but when you choose Cobalion as your Steel type, you don't actually cover the Fairy type too well, because with Cobalion's low special defense, you don't switch into Moonblast as well. You'd often have to stack another way to switch into the Fairy type. Is that worth it for a Pokemon like Cobalion for a Pokemon that's not elite? Probably not. You'd rather pick a different Pokemon that doesn't make that trade-off. At the lower power level of UU, Cobalion is excellent. where Pokemon are generally a little slower, generally a little weaker. Cobalion not being perfectly optimal is manageable, and when there isn't Landorus T or Toxapex everywhere, it's even better. For years now, it's been a staple of UU, and that puts it at number 7. Number 6 goes to 2 Pokemon actually, Nidoking and Nidoqueen, the OG King and Queen from Pokemon Red and Blue. Poison and ground coverage is one of the best dual offensive typings in Pokemon. Poison is resisted by poison and immune by steel but loses to ground, and Nidoking becomes tough to defend against because of that combo. It becomes even tougher when you factor in its amazing coverage moves like Ice Beam and Flamethrower. But in Gens 3 and 4, Nido's attack and special attack stat were too slow to be really threatening to the high stat legendaries that run the format, namely legendaries like Jirachi and Suicune. The Nidos have everything they need except the stats to compete. Black and White tried to save them with the addition of Sheer Force, and X and Y went a step further in giving Nidoking 10 more attack, but it's all just a little too late. The power creep of even newer Pokemon were too much for Nidoking and Nidoqueen to stand up to. But intuitively, they have everything they need except the raw statistical power. That means versus a lower power level, Nidoking and Nidoqueen can dominate. They often terrorize the underused format with the help of Sheer Force, making it Sludge Wave, Earth Power, Ice Beam combo almost impossible to switch into. Nidoking is a more offensive version while Nidoqueen is more defensive, but they're fundamentally very similar. Like a lot of the other underused Pokemon on this list, the Nido's strengths are very clear, but they just don't have the stats to keep up. It bullies the UU tier, and that's why it's number 6 on my list. That leads me to number 5, another ground-type Pokemon, Krookodile. Krookodile is another Pokemon who's been a UU staple just like Cobalion. Krookodile is one of the best knockoff Pokemon, period. Its knockoff is strong, and it has a great dual stab and Earthquake to threaten Fairy-type Pokemon who might try to switch in. Intimidate's a good ability, and back in the day, Krookodile was an excellent pursuit trapper. Some of its competition in early gens comes from Tyranitar. Tyranitar is a better pursuit trapper, and the value Tyranitar provides is generally more useful than having strong knockoffs. Similarly, it's harder to justify Krookodile instead of Landorus T, who also has Intimidate and knockoff. This exposes a more root issue. Krookodile is power crept. Its inherent tools aren't bad, but other Pokemon are better. As such, it's clear why Krookodile is a top Pokemon in the second tier. Stealth Rock, Knockoff, Earthquake, Pursuit, in an environment where Krookodile is evenly matched. That's an extremely consistent skill set. You always get value out of Stealth Rock, Knockoff, and Power. It's an elite second tier Pokemon, but not good enough for the first tier. At number 4, we have Mamoswine. Mamoswine isn't the most frequent mon to show up in Underused, only actually stretching from Gen 6 to 8, but it truly dominated the tier every time it was allowed. Mamoswine's biggest strength is its incredible stab-type combination backed up by a huge 130 attack stat. Ground and Ice have almost perfect synergy, with Ice hitting Grass and Flying types that Earthquake would tend to whiff on, and Earthquake hitting the Steel-type Pokemon that trainers rely on to take Ice-type attacks. When Mamoswine calls its attacks correctly, it does too much damage for teams to survive, making it a premier underused destroyer. Mamoswine's main weakness is its low speed and mediocre bulk. These stats make Mamoswine forced to switch out most of the time after getting an attack off. Having offensive prowess and taking early KOs is great, but it's one of the easiest Pokemon to revenge kill because Ice is not a good defensive type. Nonetheless, the amazing offensive power is enough to be a huge threat to defensive and balanced teams, and that makes Mamoswine the number 4 best underused Pokemon of all time. At number 3, I have Swampert. Here's why. Swampert in its maiden generation started off as one of the best non-legendary Pokemon ever. Water and Ground as a defensive typing is amazing for only having one weakness to Grass and a few key resistances, namely Fire and Rock. Swampert's ground typing giving it immunity to Sand is really important in Gen 3 because of Tyranitar, one of the top Pokemon in the format. Swampert was able to switch in comfortably to Rock and Fire type attackers without losing a ton of health in the process. But over the years, power creep did hit Swampert. By the time Black and White rolled around, the water ground type was now more hotly contested. For one, you had Gastrodon, whose Storm Drain ability nullified water type moves completely, you had Quagsire getting access to Unaware to stop setup sweepers, and you had Seismitoad with Swift Swim to take advantage of rain. Swampert didn't get anything in comparison. This pretty much meant that yes, it was a bulky water ground type which is inherently good, but it didn't have that extra gimmick. If teams wanted a water ground type, they'd usually pick from Gastrodon or because those gimmicks were so valuable. It was a good all-around Pokemon, but ultimately got power crept. Still, Swampert managed to thrive and underused in these generations. it was still fundamentally good. Not extraordinary, but good, and that's good enough for UU. The role of a bulky water type was enough to provide value to bulky offense and balanced teams. Its base stat total was good too. Swampert would rely on its fundamentals to keep itself afloat in the UU tier. It was a consistent staple Pokemon, always reliable, nothing extraordinary, but definitely good for your team. That fit the underused dynamic perfectly, and it's the third best underused Pokemon of all time. The number 2 best underused Pokemon of all time, in my opinion, is Crobat. The first thing you notice about Crobat from a competitive standpoint is its insanely high speed stat. Crobat would almost always be the fastest or one of the fastest Pokemon in underused, making it really consistent at taking KOs and going for a fast U-turn. Not only that, but Crobat actually has some pretty usable bulk and attack too, so combined with a strong Brave Bird and healing from Roost, and Crobat is kind of solid at everything. The poison flying type gives you some useful defensive interactions, like being able to take Earthquake and Fairy and fighting type attacks. Not only that, but it also got Defog in Generation 6, which made it a really good bulky pivot for a lot of different teams. Crobat could switch easily into an attack, use Defog, throw off a Brave Bird, or even U-turn for momentum. But if it's so good, why couldn't it hang out in Overused? The main issue is ultimately the stats. Crobat was trying to compete with Pokemon like Rotom Wash, Landorus T, and Tornadus T, which all are much more powerful and have much more powerful utility options like Will-O-Wisp, Intimidate, and Regenerator. Ironically, you can call Crobat too honest of a Pokemon compared to a lot of the other pivot options. It did everything good, but it didn't have an extraordinary option like Intimidate or Regenerator, which are truly valuable. Nonetheless, when those Pokemon don't exist, Crobat shines as a speed demon that can control the pace of a game. Crobat comfortably sits at the top of my all-time top 10 underused Pokemon list, only falling short of the king of UU himself. But before I get into my number 1 underused Pokemon of all time, I want to give an honorable mention to Sylveon and Florges. Sylveon and Florges are both valuable fairy types, and they have good stats, relatively good move pool, and are generally good Pokemon. But the problem is that Clefable is elite and one of the best fairy types in the game. Even though Sylveon and Florges are good, they could never compete with Clefable, and they've never been a top tier Pokemon, even though they're technically kind of good. But finally, we have the number 1 most underused Pokemon of all time, and that is Hydreigon. Despite being a pseudo-legendary and having base stats up there with Pokemon like Garchomp and Latios, Hydreigon has only been top tier in one generation, that is Gen 5. But after that, Hydreigon's been a top UU Pokemon ever since. The reason is mainly because of the Fairy type. Without the Fairy type, Hydreigon was a dominant Pokemon, and it was really good even in the top tier. But after the Fairy type, it became a lot more difficult. Hydreigon dominates UU. It's a strong Pokemon with Levitate and good stats all around. It has every good move you can think of, from the powerful Draco Meteor to Fire Blast to Roost to Taunt. It even got Nasty Plot in Generation 8. Dark and Dragon with that high special attack is difficult for most teams to manage except for the Fairy type. There were too many top Fairy type Pokemon, and Hydreigon couldn't compete with that. It can beat them in perfect scenarios like Nasty Plot plus Flash Cannon in Gen 8 or Z Belch in Gen 7, but it doesn't quite have the natural tools it needs to be consistent breaker versus those Fairy type Pokemon. You have to compare it to other Dragon types on the market. Other Dragon types often have a dual stab that can target the Fairy type, like Garchomp's Earthquake or Latios' Psychic type. Hydreigon has the unfortunate situation where it's Dark and Dragon, both who are weak to Fairy. It's brutal because Fairy is an inherently good type, and that means there are a lot of top tier Fairy type Pokemon. It's a trade-off. At what point do you pick Hydreigon despite the existence of the Fairy type? Hydreigon's such a good Pokemon that line is right at the top of underused. Hydreigon finds itself elite in UU, but not quite good enough to go further, and that makes Hydreigon my pick for the best underused Pokemon of all time. That's my list for the top 10, but remember, this is an opinion. There's plenty of other Pokemon that could have been on this list, like Rhyperior, Roserade, Scizor, so if you have other Pokemon you'd rather pick, let me know down in the comment section below.